Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. The Sociology Society is happy to have everyone here. We are honored to have Julian Go coming all the way from Chicago to do a little Q&A, talk a little bit about his work. Yeah, this is going to be a really kind of open question session. So if you're familiar with his work, which I assume most of you are, feel free to just ask general questions, intellectual questions, and yeah, I'll turn it over to Julian. He can tell us a little bit about his work and himself.
Great, well, thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thanks to the Society. I can hear there's a really nice Cambridge Sociology Society you have. So thanks. Yeah, if you don't know what I do, I'm a sociologist. I'm a historical sociologist and I guess a social theorist. Yeah, I'm at the University of Chicago in sociology. And I started out my work, my career studying colonialism and empire. And my first couple books were about US colonialism in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And then I have a book about the US empire compared with the British Empire. This is the early 2000s. Yes, that dates me, I'm very old. But in the early 2000s, questions of empire were really potent, questions of American empire. And I got really involved in those kinds of debates. And throughout then I had an interest in post-colonial theory, having done graduate work at the University of Chicago in the 1990s, where there was a lot of post-colonial theorists in different disciplines, though they weren't in sociology, right? They were in history and English. Homi Bhabha was in English there. Dipesh Chakrabarti was in history. And so I had read a lot of post-colonial theory, and then I later, after I started working on colonialism and empire, I also started thinking about what could post-colonial theory mean for sociology. And so I have a book on post-colonial theory, and I've been doing a lot of work in that area. More recently, I've been doing work on anti-colonial theory and thinking about these anti-colonial theorists of the 20th century, well, anti-colonial thinkers, activists, writers, thinking about their work as actual social theory, as a kind of intellectual resource that expands our sociological imagination, rather than sticking with the traditional canon. I've been interested in expanding that canon and incorporating new viewpoints, new standpoints, new ideas. And I've been thinking about anti-colonial thought as a really generative space, really generative field for sociological ideas. And then I also have been doing work on policing in the British and American context. And I'll be talking about that tomorrow. My latest book is on policing in the US and British empires. And I basically argue that policing, modern policing as we know it in Britain and the United States, is an effect of the boomerang. It's been modeled after and constructed as a colonial tool of power within Britain and within the United States. So that's my latest work, and that represents the kind of historical sociology I do. I think about history as really important for thinking about the present, and it's theoretically informed. It's really, I think of it as a post-colonial, as a historical sociology that's informed by post-colonial thought. If any of you come tomorrow to the talk, you might be able to get a better sense of why I think that. So yeah, just a general introduction. I don't know. I'm trying to be pretty relaxed, and it doesn't have to be formal. Yeah.
All right, awesome. Does anyone have any questions to start us off with? Who's gonna do it? Who's gonna be the first one?
Well, you said you had a question. You can start us off with.
Okay. In the global project of decolonizing sociology, what is the role of language in research and scholarship? As the English language is quite hegemonic in academia, how might we reimagine the circulation of ideas other than through their translation into English?
Yeah, that's a tough question. How do I start it off? That's right. No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, let's face it. English hegemony is a thing. It's a global structure, and of course, the language reflects that. And our entire global institutional apparatus is structured around the English-speaking dominant universities. And so I think that there's a number of things that can be done to open it up to different languages. But the first thing that needs to be done is that students need to learn languages, and we scholars actually need to learn different languages. And it's a shame because actually to get a PhD in most sociology departments in the United States, you used to have a foreign language requirement. But as sociology has undergone various changes, which aren't necessarily at all for the better. A lot of departments have stripped their foreign language requirements. So that would have been I think an important first step towards thinking about how we can go beyond the hegemony of English language, but it's an uphill battle. There's so many pressures on education to be basically more dumb, and various pressures, market pressures, political pressures, government pressures. So it's an uphill battle, and I think that we need to just take foreign languages and foreign cultures more seriously if we're gonna ever make that change. And again, I think that the problem is that it's an uphill battle. The forces are not with us on that front.
This is a bit of a basic question.
Do you want to introduce yourself so I know who you are?
Yeah, I'm Dalma.
I know.
So this is a basic question, but I'm just kind of interested in your point of view of this. So what do you see as the differences between decolonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial? Or do you even think that those distinctions are useful at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of academics who have a lot of investment in those terms. I don't. I think that they're all more or less referring to what I think of as anti-colonial movements coming out of the 20th century. So I think the source is anti-colonialism. In the 19th and 20th century, these movements around the world that fundamentally challenged the dominance of European American empires, challenged all the associated structures of those systems. They really, I think, provide the intellectual base for what we now call post-colonial and decolonial thought. I think post-colonial and decolonial are sort of different branches that just get expressed in different disciplines and among different sectors of the academy in different countries. But I think they share a fundamental spirit of anti-colonial thought and anti-colonial movements, which is to question, challenge, critique the way in which the global European, Anglo-European American empires have constructed the world. So I don't take a lot of stock in a lot of the minor differences. I think that anti-colonialism is the source, and then everything sort of branches out from there, and there are different ways. You'll probably encounter and have encountered people who put a lot of thought in those concepts. I don't. I think that the sort of debates about what they mean are worth having, but I would prefer to just focus on the similarities. Worrying about these labels, which it becomes this really annoying Borgesian game of distinction sometimes when certain people are sort of worrying about these different terms. And I just would prefer to think about the similarities. But great question, yeah.
I just had a question kind of about like the leader of academia and the current like political situation in the US and the way that the establishment or even different politicians will criticize maybe even like your work or like post-colonial thinking and just like lump it all into like the side of like critical race theory and talk about it, but like not at all engage with the actual ideas, but just kind of like lumping it. How do you view kind of your role as an academic to respond to these sort of like external pressures? And isn't there, or could there be like a threat that people, because it seems that like the outside world doesn't understand what the academics are doing, they kind of just like come together and they don't engage so much with the outside world?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's a complicated one. I had a student, an undergraduate student from the Cambridge University newspaper undergrad interview me, and she was really interested in this question. And as I was answering her, I began to realize it's a really complicated question, and I think a lot of academics that are involved in these issues have a lot of different answers. My own thought is, well, there's a couple things. First of all, universities, critical scholarship has always been under siege and always been attacked by both the right and some sectors of the mainstream. And a lot of that is just to be expected. And there's a part of me that thinks if we're being attacked, then we're doing something right. I take W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, as a good sort of model of someone who really dealt with this his whole career, and he was really articulating counter-hegemonic research and counter-hegemonic ideas, and of course his work got attacked even from within the academy. So this is a long-standing thing, and so there are different ways in which we can deal with it, and one of them I think you hit upon, which is to realize that this is just long-standing, and in some ways people aren't going to be convinced otherwise. There's just a sector of the right wing, for example, that is always going to attack certain critical thought, whether it's coming from the university or not. And maybe they're so rabid and so narrow-minded and that there's really not much one can do to try to convince them. It's like trying to convince voters, who are vote for certain politicians like Trump, to try to convince them not to. It just doesn't work. There's a certain stubbornness already, so it's not worth it. I think what's important is to just keep hitting the message that sociology, the kind of critical work we do, is not just ideology, and that's really what's important, because usually the way these attacks go is that they dismiss critical ideas coming from the academy as just ideological and not proper science, right? And so this becomes the way in which, or it's not objective, it's not truth, it's just all politics, it's just all ideology. Sociology is, in particular, at least in the United States, seen as just a left-wing propagandist machine, and that's just wrong. I mean, it's just wrong, and I think that the best thing that sociologists can do is just remind people and show people that this is not just ideology, that these are social truths that we discover through research and very rigorous research, and that it is, I don't want to have to say it's a science, but it is, it's not just ideology. And so I think we need to just continue to make that argument as best we can to the people that will listen. And for me, that means students. I have a lot of students in the US. You get a lot of students who aren't necessarily sociology majors who end up taking your classes because they're curious. And in that context, they can begin to see that what they hear on the outside or before they came to the class about sociologists being purely ideological is not true, right? That they can begin to see it for what it really is. And so that's part of the publics too that I try to talk to. Yeah, I think it's an ongoing struggle, and it's always been, right? But again, I actually, a lot of us in the United States we were both disappointed and very, in a sense, proud that in Florida, the conservative governor had sort of been attacking sociology, because we're doing something right if DeSantis is criticizing sociology. So I think that we have to have a sort of a broader view about it too, and not get too, we should just keep on top of the larger struggle, which is to make sure that we're producing good knowledge and make sure that we're constantly making those arguments.
Hi, I'm Ariel, I'm a second year psychologist. So I was wondering that I know that there's a lot of effort to kind of rename these value-free objective social ideas like modernity with prefixes like white or European. But do you think that this is a good step for kind of reconciling anti-colonialism and social theory, or do you think it leads to greater centralization by race? And do you think that it's a productive step towards?
To use categories like white.
So to like add those prefixes to like traditionally like objective sociology.
Right. Yeah, I think that if it's done with explication, which is always the case, right? Good ideas always require explication. So as long as it's not used as jargon, I think it's important to recognize. So this is the thing about whiteness or race in general. I mean, it's a construction, but because it's a construction, it has it's real. And we constantly have to be working with that tension, right? So you have to be able to say, yeah, there's something called whiteness that has pervaded certain aspects of our society, including certain aspects of social scientific thought or the academy, but also not essential. Right? And recognize that it's whiteness in the sense that it's historically constructed as that, and it's been made into that. And so it's constructed, but it's real. And I think that as long as we keep that up, I think it's a fine term. I think the danger is essentialism. And that's a real danger, but there's a sense in which one can easily just argue one's way out of essentialism and just constantly stress that this whiteness is not about, it's about a constructed system. It's a very good question. But then, just broadly speaking, it's essentialism that's the danger. Whether it be about race, whether it be about cultures, whether it be about political conflicts like what's going on in Gaza right now. It's the binaries and the essentialisms that is I think real part of the danger. So constantly work against that, to think beyond the boundaries and think beyond essentialist thought is really crucial. I think sociology is a particularly good tool for that, but I also think that sociology, like any mode of thought, can run into the dangers of essentialism as well. So it needs to be constantly challenged.
Hi, my name is Vishal. I'm doing a PhD here in sociology, and I'm studying caste elites in India.
Yeah.
So in India, the decolonial narrative or the discourse is being kind of appropriated by the ruling elite. And this is interesting quote that I read recently, that decolonization in India is kind of recolonization of caste elites and of caste supremacy. That kind of makes me wonder if this notion of decolonialism or postcolonialism, or whichever term you prefer to use, is more of a discursive paradigm than it is of any other use of force. If it's more of a, like you said, construction,
Yeah.
And if construction, just because the concept doesn't not make it real, does it become more of an epistemic condition more than a use of violence or use of force, or in any other way colonialism manifests?
Can you repeat that last part?
So from what I understand from seeing decolonization or post-colonization narratives in India, is that it seems to be a more epistemic discourse than it is of actual use of or what we understood of colonization earlier as extraction or use of force, or like civilizing the natives or something like that.
So I think maybe if I understand your question correctly, and thank you for that, I think maybe you're hitting on something which I think is really important, which is the way in which a narrative or a post-colonial or decolonial narrative or terms get weaponized in problematic ways, and they become just not recognizable anymore. So if I understand, I don't know the context you're talking about, but I've heard some things and I can get a sense of it because I've seen it in other contexts that I do know, like the Philippines. Anti-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial kinds of critiques of the West, for example, they just become weaponized in a really crude way, right? And they actually reproduce the imperial episteme, in my view, right? They fall back to certain kinds of essentialism or certain problematic nationalisms, right? That, that I think scholars and thinkers like Edward C. would say and have said in the past that these are just actual reproductions of the colonialist way of thinking, the reproductions of the essentialist way of thinking. So I think that's a real trend that you're talking about, and it points to the larger point. Any concept, any idea is open to appropriation and misappropriation. Right? And that's the constant thing intellectuals have to fight against. mean, that's, I think, one of the things intellectuals are for, is to call out misappropriation of ideas. And if intellectuals don't do it, no, scholars don't do it, no one can. And there's a violence to those misappropriations, and we need to be constantly fighting against those. So it is an epistemic issue, and it's a discursive issue. And it's an important one because, again, as I think Said and other intellectuals coming in the anti-colonial or post-colonial tradition will point out and remind us, right, the discursive epistemic conditions are the conditions for the violence, the conditions for the politics that are so problematic. So the epistemic and the discursive has to be a traitor struggle as well. And we have to fight against those misappropriations as well. Thank you for your question.
Hi, my name is Antonia and I'm a primary media sociologist. So my question is, well, firstly, people kind of describe what's happening right now in Gaza as like a mass like radicalization event in terms of like people are kind of opening their eyes to like Western imperialism essentially. So how do you think the West, like people are going to think about the West from now onwards, and how do you think the West can recover from it essentially?
So you mean that the conflict in Gaza is shedding light on the complicity of the United States and other powers?
Yeah, and also just like, yes, the complicity of so-called like liberal democracies,
yeah,
and how they find like previous violence.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's happening. I think that there is very powerful critiques coming around. People are coming around to seeing things that they hadn't seen in the same way before. So I do think there's something to that. And I think it can have a real, yeah, I think the possibilities are unclear as to where it's going to go from here. But I think you're right. There is a kind of consciousness raising that's going on that I'm seeing. And that's very exciting. And it's also, you know, unclear where it's going to go. So unfortunately, I don't have any more. I don't have like any tea. I can't read the tea leaves, but I think it's a powerful moment, and I would only urge that we remain vigilant about the way in which the discourse goes, and that we make sure that we seize upon those possibilities properly. I'm sorry, second year what too? Architecture, okay, yeah.
I was just wondering, I know a lot of what I'm saying is that like we don't live in a post-colonial world because colonialism isn't really over in terms of like it persists, whether the conceptual thought or the way in which human real and colonial legacies continue. I was wondering, how do you think we can move towards kind of decolonizing thought within previous colony? Like from an architecture standpoint, like, we continue to see like the West as best due to like the way that colonialism leaders within education and within like thought of, you know, Western supremacy.
Yeah.
I was wondering kind of how do we move forward as a society in terms of like dealing with this lingering colonialism within the way in which we think.
Yeah.
Inherently.
That's a really great question, and I think again there's a number of possibilities. One of the things that I have put a lot of stock in is recognizing the richness and diversity of thought in the colonial and ex-colonial world, and recognizing that thought as valuable and making it known and making it be seen as valuable. So that's one of the main motivations behind the project I have been sort of thinking about anti-colonial thought as sources of knowledge and recognizing them as such. A lot of those anti-colonial thinkers are coming from the colonial world, and they've been writing against colonialism for their, you know, amidst their movements, but they also are generating all these really interesting ideas and knowledge. And so I think what needs to be done is to recognize that those alternative traditions as valid and as legitimate. And unfortunately, much of the structures of the universities today don't see them as valid and legitimate, and that seeps into unfortunately, the ex-colonial world as well, right? Where the Western hegemony of knowledge production is very strong. So I think that, you know, we just need to constantly be looking to at these other sources and treating them properly and thinking about them as really important insights. You know, I'll give you one example. Last week, I spent the week in Paris giving lectures on racial capitalism and talking about policing and racism. And one of the complexities about talking about race in France is that mainstream sociologists just don't buy it. They see it as an American imposition. And you know, it's not indigenous to France and so on. But if you read Fanon or César, of course, they're talking about race. I mean, those kinds of thinkers really have a lot of knowledge and insights about racialization within the French Empire. And one can point to those thinkers as really important thinkers that provide an alternative to the canon. And so, you know, the problem is, of course, mainstream sociologists don't think of Fanon and César as proper social thinkers. And I think the challenge is to show them that they are proper social thinkers. One of the arguments is always like, well, they don't really write proper sociology. But that doesn't mean that even some of our conventional theorists don't do sociology. For example, one of the texts that's often assigned in American universities to undergrads to get them to understand Marx is the Communist Manifesto, which is a political pamphlet, right? And yet we somehow treat that as social theory, but we don't treat Fanon's Wretched of the Earth as social theory. And we need to be constantly, you know, pointing out those imbalances and those epistemic imbalances. And you know, I would make the argument to the death that Fanon should be an important part of the French intellectual epistemic canon, and he is talking about race. Just that, you know, it's one example among many. There's also scholars like Farid Alatas talking about Ibn Khaldun as providing an important source of sociological knowledge. And in many ways, Ibn Khaldun was he was one of the first social thinker. So just there's, you know, lots of examples that we could point to, and I think that that's the first step towards overthrowing the Western hegemony in knowledge production.
I thought what you just said was really interesting because I'm from France, and so I had like a first-hand experience of this sort of like colorblind approach that they try to have to race in France, and how it's just like so different here, especially like in curriculum, like the Fanon was never like spoken about. But do you think, like, how useful is it to have these sort of like transnational concepts? Because like if you go to France and they tell you no, like this doesn't apply here, but then you can see how it has worked like in the US, it has worked in the UK, but it doesn't become part of the canon in France. Is that like, what do you think that's due to?
I think there's a certain provincialism to all intellectual fields and national fields. I mean, there's the same kind of provincialism among American academics to outside ideas as well. So I think that's just a common thing. I do think sociology in France, for example, has been, and the French Academy has been particularly white in ways that other countries, US and Britain, have made a little bit more progress on. And I think that universities in France have been particularly, in terms of the faculty, in terms of the intellectual field, I think it's been particularly conservative when it comes to these issues. So I would say it's a combination of those two things, of the particular resistance in France and the nature of the sort of more conservative intellectual field when it comes to questions of race, and also just a general sort of refusal of a lot of, yeah, whether you're American or British or French or German, that there's always been a kind of skepticism to foreign concepts. But in France, it's particularly strong. I think there's complex history of French colonialism and the French approaches to colonialism, which I think we have to puzzle out more, but I think that that's a real part of it. I mean, the way in which the the massacre of Algerians in Paris is sort of not really taken seriously. The way in which Bourdieu did a lot of his early thinking in Algeria, but it's only his later writings that get picked up. I mean, there's a whole history and particularity to the way in which the French intellectual field has been resistant to questions of colonialism and race more broadly. It's a very powerful intellectual field. There's one there in the back.
Hi, I'm Patch. I'm a PhD student in the department. I was just thinking about your paper on decolonizing sociology and the importance of provincializing social theory. I read that paper in undergrad and I taught it last year. And I was just thinking about how we could, I guess, reconcile universality and provincialism in social theory, because I'm currently working in the context, my field is in Malaysia, and I use a lot of social theory that is not, I guess, quote unquote indigenous, like it doesn't come from our canons or a particular context. And I've been criticized before for drawing on ideas and concepts from other places. So I was just wondering, is there a way to, I guess, like reconcile universality and provincialism with regards to like post-colonial research?
Yeah.
Like, I understand the importance of like provincializing European social
Yeah.
law because we don't offer that same, I guess, criticism to
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think it's an important one, and I don't know if I have a simple answer. I will say the tension is real because on the one hand, you don't want to universalize Western thinkers, but on the other hand, I don't think some kind of like romanticized indigeneity is the answer either. This is also a reproduction of a kind of binary. So I think that for me, what's most interesting are the thinkers and theorists who are engaged in some kind of conversation or, I mean, so for example, anti-colonial thinkers, they don't represent any form of indigenous thought. Like Fanon doesn't represent some kind of deep African, essential way of thought. He's engaging with Western thought, but he's coming at it from the perspective of a colonized subject who's had a distinct set of experiences and a standpoint that needs to be brought in. So I would prefer not to think about it in terms of West versus some kind of geographically defined essential indigeneity. I think that what we need to do is proliferate the standpoints, and standpoints don't necessarily map onto geography. So I do think there's a certain generality to certain standpoints that dominant sociology overlooks. And again, just to take someone like Fanon or Du Bois, I think that their ideas travel to other contexts precisely because they're speaking to a social situation of, say, colonial racialized domination, which itself is general, right? That also exists in other parts of the world, not least due to the spread of European-based capitalism and racial capitalism. So the experiences that a lot of thinkers theorize from make those theories more generalizable than the particular geographic location. The problem with so much dominant sociology is that it has tended to only operate from the experiences of the sort of European imperial standpoint, right? And other standpoints are rejected as not relevant. And that's what I've been trying to fight against, and others are fighting against too. But again, it's not a geographic essential. I really don't want it to fall into these kinds of essentialisms. Like, we need like a native Filipino tradition of thought. That just reproduces the kinds of essentialisms. What we need are to proliferate the standpoints that are general and that they don't just fall back into particular national or cultural or geographic contexts. I hope that helps a little bit. Yeah, okay. There's another hand there, yeah.
So there's been a lot, I'm a second year, I'm sociology student here. And there's been a lot of discussion about essentialism and like the risk and how no one wants to descend into that point. So I was just wondering if you could like perhaps like highlight a bit of the ways in which you rather navigate it when you're teaching sociology, because especially in my experience currently, I literally came out with a lecture today that was called Black Sociology, not Black Social Theory, and it's really interesting to me how I really do like sympathize with the fact that it should be taught and it should be more centered in the same way that Marxism and functionalism and things like that are centered in the teaching of sociology. So just how do you go about making sure postcolonial thought doesn't become something that's only accessible when you specialize further on into your like academic career? Like I studied sociology since I was 14, and I only got up and had postcolonial thought briefly in the first year, and then I chose to do it in a topic within a paper that was broad enough that I would never have to encounter it in second year at university. So yeah, how would you go about, I guess, properly handling rewriting the
Yeah, that's also a very good question, and I think that there are different ways to go about it. But again, for me, I would repeat this kind of point that we really need to be careful of essentializing thought into constructed identities and taking those as essential. So rather than a Black social theory, I think that's good as long as it's emphasized that Black represents a standpoint that might be socially general to other groups as well, right? And I would just be, again, it's about making sure that the criteria for inclusion and the kinds of authors that we read and the traditions we read isn't essentialist, right? So I try to think about a social standpoint, a social position, in other words, something like a subaltern marginalized position. That's really, I think, what is not always fully represented. And that marginalized position has been occupied by people of the African diaspora. It's been occupied by people of other identities, races, and other cultures. Again, because of the global social system, which is hierarchical and oppressive, there are social positions on the bottom that again transcend Blackness or Asianness or whatever. And so I personally think that that's the way to go, to make sure that if we're going to rewrite the canon, then we think about including figures not because of the race or ethnic identity or geographic location, but because of the social standpoint that they represent and how they can help us rethink things. I mean, many of these debates go back to the debates over feminist sociology and feminist thought in the 70s and 80s, right? There was a real danger that feminist theorists and feminist thinkers faced of, and they themselves articulated the nature of essentializing woman, right? And I think what came out of that debate is the understanding that they have to think about standpoints, positions of oppression, or some kind of social structure position, not just rooted in biology or much less racial identity or other kinds of identity. So yeah, I'm really about these standpoints rather than these sort of essentialized identities. Yeah.
Hi, I'm also Hannah. I'm a graduate and finalist in sociology. I know you've been working a lot on content histories and the relation to society. So my question was, how can I go about to deconstruct or challenge characters that deny these connections?
Can you repeat that? That deny which connections?
So like in your work is about content histories and relation to society.
Right.
But a lot of I feel like narratives around that don't deny those connections. So
Deny connections.
Yeah, so how do you go about to challenge
Yeah, so this is where I think that's a great question. And this is where I think my position as a theorist who's also very much empirically rooted, rooted in empirical research as well. I think that one can challenge narratives of disconnection by the empirics. For example, this is my whole argument in my book, which is based upon policing, which is based upon years of empirical historical research into the history of policing. The common narratives of policing in Britain, United States, is that it's something that just is constituted by and shaped by things that happen in the United States or Britain. But when you actually dig into the empirics and the history, you see that they've been connected to colonialism, they've been connected to policing in the imperial peripheries. And to trace that out empirically then is the argument. That's the argument to show you can't understand what's going on in this one place without recognizing the connections. And that largely does have to be done empirically. That's where research matters. In some cases, actually, the connections aren't going to be that relevant, right? It's not that they're always going to be relevant, but in many cases they are. And so the argument always has to be to those articulating the narrative of disconnection that, look, if you don't understand these connections, you're not understanding the very thing that you think you understand. And a lot of that has to be done empirically. And to me, that's what's great about sociology. It's very theoretical, and we think about broader issues, but we also base ourselves in social reality and the empirical research that allows us to observe that social reality.
I'm actually just conscious of time as well, because I want to make sure that Anna can have some time to ask some of her broader questions as well. So do we have any more questions from, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
I was just wondering whether you think the onus to combat epistemic injustice within the academy lies with individual academics such as yourself, or academics in institutions such as Cambridge, or if you think the challenge needs to come from somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a great question. So by somewhere else, what kinds of?
I mean, maybe just because obviously Cambridge and sort of prestigious universities in the West, whether it should be individuals who have this influence, or if it should be sort of more grassroots activism. Not that academics in Cambridge can't do that, but
right. I think it should come from wherever it can be. But I do think students have an important role.
Yeah.
And I think students have to demand this. Because that's how curriculums changed in the United States in the first place. Students demanded it in the 60s and 70s, the student movements that made demands. And the students who are recognizing and remembering that the university is theirs. It's not the faculty, it's the students. And they tried to make universities the way that they wanted to be. With more or less success and with failures, but still, that movement came from the students, and I think that that's an important lesson, is that students have to make demands. So I think it has to come from students. That's how people are going to be swayed at the top. That's how other faculty who are skeptical could be swayed. And then it also has to happen through alliances between the individual faculty or administrators who are sympathetic and trying to advance this to align with the students. So I think it has to come from multiple fronts. And then there's another one.
Yeah, I'm just struck by the multidisciplinary approach to your work. And my question was what you think the role of literature is in formulations of social thought. And by literature, I mean like poetry or novels. And I asked that because when you were talking about Fanon, I was thinking that like a lot of his criticism is based on the kind of romanticization of indigeneity in the poetry of like Leopold Sedar Senghor or like Césaire. A lot of his thought manifests itself in poetry. And I'm coming at it from I'm history and French undergrad, so I don't know much about sociology, but I'm interested in that multidisciplinary approach.
Yeah, that's a great question too, because I do think an important part of rethinking the canon is also rethinking what we mean by social theory and the form in which it comes. So the example I gave of Marx and Engels, it's a political pamphlet, but there's also theory there. Similarly, anti-colonialists write poetry and they made art. These are all forms of expression that contain and have the possibility, at least, to contain social theory as well. So part of expanding our canon can't just be expanding who we read it. Also, by the same token, canon should be expanding the mediums and the forms in which they come. And in many ways, that's how you're going to get the anti-colonial thought, because Fanon didn't have time to write a 500-page academic book arguing with Cambridge sociologists to get published with Cambridge University Press. The man was busy fighting a fucking war, right? So, anti-colonial thought is a good example of how the medium in which social thought is expressed can come from a lot of different forms. So I think literature is a particularly, especially for the anti-colonialists, like the surrealists in particular, right? A couple of years ago, was it the Tate Modern had a great exhibit on surrealism and anti-colonialism, and it really brought home that, man, the surrealists were anti-colonialists, and they were expressing these ideas through various mediums. But for a sociologist, you know, it was really fascinating to try to see and recognize and respect that these other artistic forms are also forms of social theory as well.
Thank you so much for coming today. I'm Jack. I'm a final year student in political sociology. And one of the things I picked up on throughout the talk is you referred on several occasions, obviously, the importance of empirical work in like sociological analysis and sociological fieldwork. One of the things which I've had skepticism, I don't know if that's the best word, but skepticism about in regards to the importance of empirical analysis is oftentimes the very possibility of using, like, you know, when we derive like kind of empirical data or empirical analysis, it's relying on subjects interpolating themselves within the very terms themselves, which are contingent a lot of the time upon power relations as they exist. So, for example, like if you're doing a survey and other people are self-identifying as Black, autistic, or different terminologies, these are terms which are not absolute, they're not objective in the sense of, you know, it's kind of like trying to historical sense. They're very historically rooted in certain continuities of power. Now, when a theorist like Althusser, for example, then talks about that, he would term that, even despite the fact that it's empirical, he would term it to be ideological. Because it is still contingent within those terminologies established by power itself. Now, my concern is that with sociology as a vehicle for change, it often seems that when we focus so much on the empirical side, we comprehend power relations, we comprehend the field of power as it currently exists, without actually challenging the speakability of those discourses themselves. So my question would be, how can we move from the comprehension of these discourses and the comprehension of these terms to the annulment of these terms, to making them no longer speakable as discourses of power?
That's a very good question. And I think it gets at the heart of the difference between what I would think of as critical social science and just standard social science. And one of the key differences that's involved in critical social science is really, it's informed by critical theory, right? That's cognizant of the fact that the concepts and categories in which people live are reflections of power. And cognizant of the fact that those concepts and categories cover up deeper relations. So it's not just about, so doing empirical work and good empirical work as a sociologist can't just be about pure phenomenology. It's not just empirics, right? We have to come to the empirics with theory, right? Theory that allows us to think critically about those very empirics and to think about how you get beyond and beneath them. And that involves all kinds of methods. It involves historical methods, it involves ethnography. It definitely doesn't necessarily just involve surveys, although it could involve really clever surveys. And so I think that the key is to have a depth ontology, a recognition that structures of power in our society are reflected in our everyday discourse and that we need to cut beneath them, and that crucially, social science should not reflect those categories of power, right? And that's what I think distinguishes a critical social science from a non-critical one, which takes those categories of power for granted and even as the basis of their whole science, such as economics, right? So I really think that we have to take very seriously this point you're making, and I think that's the beginnings of a critical social science. And it really is about reading the empirics also with a critical mind informed by theory. Thank you. It's a great question.
Yeah, thank you for your sharing. I'm Selena. I'm doing sociology, and before I was doing politics and history. So my question will lie on the proliferation of standpoints, as you just mentioned. When we talk about proliferation or like transcending different standpoints, so how do we really position ourselves in the complex situation, especially introducing a transnational perspective and also connections, circulations, movements, sometimes decoding and coding with misunderstandings or miscapturing. Basically, my question relates to both theoretical understanding and empirical research, especially when we stop, when we position, where we position, and when we stop or when we set the boundary. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really big question. Yeah, it's a really important one. And again, I don't think it can be, I'm not sure I have like a single answer for that, because it's so dependent upon the particular context you're looking at. I think that the first step just has to be a certain kind of reflexivity that is reflective about the categories that one is using. And this kind of goes back to this other question, that there has to be some recognition that the concepts and categories that we might use initially to understand what's going on in these other contexts, or think about circulations, or to go beyond our limited understanding, that these concepts they have limits, and that we have to be ready to work with the limits. And I think those moments when the concepts meet the limits is where you really have the most exciting sort of exciting intellectual sort of and possibilities for thinking beyond the categories. So yeah, it's a very abstract answer, but again, these are, it might just depend upon the context. But if I had to give a kind of broader rule, it would have to be a self-reflexivity about the concepts that we use, and a willingness to work with the concepts to show their limits. It's about showing the limits of the concepts that enable some way to go beyond them.
So we'll be a little bit of time, I think, to chat with Julian, particularly shy. I want to after, but I'll let Anna
do some sort of general questions to just wrap us up. If that's all right.
Yeah, no, I had one that I've been meaning to ask, because we've talked a lot about teaching sociology, teaching social theory particularly, and the canon, namely. Every member of the canon shares the same form of theory, in the sense that it is formally academic text. How do you go about teaching students to theorize alternatively? So in the courses that you taught, have you done anything that's really intended to challenge the normativity of that?
The normativity of reading the sociological texts that are meant to be sociological.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I do teach, one example would be courses where we read Fanon and Césaire and some of Du Bois's early work, which actually, some of his later work doesn't seem very sociological at all. We read anti-colonial pamphlets, and so it's about, again, there's no simple rule except to expose your eyes and your mind to other forms, and to learn how to engage with them as social texts, and to basically, it involves a lot of reading between the lines. It involves a lot of contextualization of the text as well. But again, it's similar to reading the Communist Manifesto, which again is a political pamphlet, but we teach students how to read it for sociology. I don't think the principles should be that different for other things. have students approach the text with a sociological imagination. In many ways, that's the formula. Easier said than done, but that's the trick. We're supposed to approach everything with a sociological imagination, particularly these texts that we might not automatically think of as classic, conventional social theoretical texts.
And I guess to wrap it up, I'd be so curious to hear, because I know a lot of people in this room are final year undergraduates. Could you maybe walk us through your journey from undergrad to grad school to where you are now?
I have to talk about myself. That's very embarrassing. Yeah, look, by the time I was, I guess I was a junior in college, I realized that I didn't want to leave the world of academia. I realized that the ideas that I was learning about, the discussions I was having, were just too rich, and I had some sense of this world out there that I had some sense of it as not being necessarily the place where these ideas are nurtured and bandied about. And I had read my Marx and Alienated Labor, and I knew that the world is structured around forcing us to get involved and become alienated laborers. So, I ended up in sociology because of social thought of people who told me the way the world is. And yeah, I knew pretty early on. And plus, I didn't really have any other skills anyway, which is, kind of realize what else could I do? But read and critique and talk and maybe do some research. Yeah, so I was very conscious of that. Yeah, that's how I ended up. I applied to grad school and just did my best.
Any advice for anyone thinking about grad school?
And is anyone here thinking about grad school? Raise your hand. Okay. Yeah, that's a tricky one because I think everybody has their own path to grad school, but I will say it does require, one thing I've learned is that to fly, you have to submit to the wind. By this, I mean, we have these disciplines, and disciplines don't just mean an area of study, they mean discipline. They mean that you have to embody that body of thought. And on the one hand, disciplines are bad. On the other hand, this is what I mean about submitting to the wind, disciplines can be liberating. So, you have to master the field if you're going to conquer it and push it further. So that requires a lot of discipline. And so I guess I would just say, don't be afraid of discipline and don't be afraid of trying to better understand that which you want to change, right? Because there's no other way to do it. You really can't come at it from the outside. And use the disciplinary tools of the field you're in to do what you want to do. But again, remember that you're learning the tools of a discipline, and there are some good things about the discipline of thought and practice that the disciplines impose. Again, just sociology, I think, has wonderful tools that we can learn from. Despite all my critiques of sociology, I critique it because I think it's too important and the tools are too powerful to be in the wrong hands. And I think something as simple as a sociological imagination, something as simple as learning these quantitative methods, like we're trained in the US in grad school, we're trained to do a lot of statistics and stuff, and I actually end up using it. It's like learning the master's tools against the master, and I think that there's something to be said for that. It's not easy, but you have to sort of keep that in mind that what you're doing is equipping yourself to do what you want to do.
Awesome. All right, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your wonderful questions.
Yeah, and again, I just want to say a couple of points. First of all, it's so nice to see a lot of familiar faces and also some new ones. Like, we just want to really thank you on behalf of the society. The interest you guys have shown us throughout this year has been so amazing, especially for this event. And yeah, like our committee is wrapping up soon, so this is like one of our last events as a committee. So yeah, means a lot, everyone's support. Obviously, we want to thank Julian most of all for giving us some of his very, very precious time. Means a lot. And yeah, we have the room for a little bit longer in case anyone has a searing question that they really want to ask Julian in private, because I know it's nerve-wracking speaking in front of a group, so I know people might want to do that. But yeah, so we hope you all enjoyed and had a good event. So yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you.